ESL interpretation for lecture number 4.
To the theater. That's more than double of what would normally be. Hey, welcome back to class. In case you couldn't guess, we're talking about the 1920s. We have no book musicals right now, but Broadway taught the nation to sing and dance in the Roaring Twenties. Broadway becomes the popularizer of the new modern Charleston, jazz, and slang. They all get promoted. The Shubert Theater on 44th Street is the home of the famous producers, the Shubert Brothers, who helped to make the 1920s the most prodigious decade in Broadway history. In the Jazz Age, New York was the syncopated city, and Broadway, the Big Apple, was the goal of all ambition. You could see Al Jolson, the Marx Brothers, live on stage, and songwriters like the Gershwins and Rodgers and Hart. They created fascinating rhythms. Thanks to the power of the press and the arrival of radio and the talking pictures, everyone could hear the siren song of Broadway. Let's give a little listen to that. Here's Al Jolson.
Goodbye. Don't cry. The little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then out, do it over again. Watch for the mail. I never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
Even just seeing the audio, you can get the power of Al Jolson's energy, can't you? Broadway in the 20s was a showcase for the sweeping changes that transformed American culture. New York was the mecca of the Jazz Age, and Broadway was its glamorous shrine, a place where fame was first manufactured. The 20s are a time of incredibly rapid change, incredibly quick modernization. This is the decade when Broadway and the musical theater are at the height of their influence. It was a tremendously rich and exciting time in theater. Now, think of this. I have to ask Al to be quiet here for a moment so I can give you these numbers. Listen to this. In 1927, you had 250 shows opening, 50 of them musicals, and you had 20 million people going to the theater. That's more than double of what would normally be on Broadway today. From 1920 to 1929, you were really sitting on a rainbow. Everything was lovely. A new era on Broadway began on January the 16th, 1919, when the sale of alcohol was outlawed in New York. The night before Prohibition is enacted, the New York people run wild. They run around with bottles and baby carriages. They're buying every last bottle that they probably can to store. They really think the supply of liquor is going to run out. And what really happened instead? New York led the nation in carelessness of its enforcement of Prohibition. We had 3,200 speakeasies on Broadway. 3,200 speakeasies between 42nd and 55th Street. Woo! This is a very creative period for language. We had passwords at speakeasies, and that influenced our regular speaking, our everyday language. The classes, lower, middle, upper, all the classes were mingling, and they were mingling with the underworld because everyone was breaking the law. Let me find you a song for that. When you're after fun and laughter the sound comedy. It's a time of liberated sensibilities and a feeling that life is full of youth and vigor, and the music of the 1920s and jazz really calls the beat of a new age. And the songs that are coming out of Broadway are really registering this kind of shift in American sensibility.
5'2", eyes of blue, but oh, what those 5 foot could do. Has anybody seen my gal? Turned up nose, turned down hose, never had no other beau. Has anybody seen my gal? Now if you want to have fun with the view of the football, Ryan Prince and Harold Lace, bet your life they to her. Could she love, could she rule, could she cook, could she do? Has anybody seen my gal?
Just listening to the music makes you want to have fun, makes you want to go to a party. Certainly. New York theater, particularly musical comedy, is about the pace of change, and nothing was changing as fast as the American woman. Look at what the woman was wearing in 1914 and what she's wearing in 1922. Her hair is gone, her skirts are short, her hips have disappeared, her back is in view. She's smoking and drinking. She's kind of trashed the past en route to the party at the Speakeasy. And what would attract theater and musical comedy more than something changing that fast? While American women were enjoying new freedoms, the heroines of Broadway were coming into their own good fortune. Audiences fell in love with Cinderella stories, musical comedies in which the main character might be a dishwasher in Act 1, but marry the man of her dreams just before the final curtain. Many of the musicals of the day were about women. There was a show called Mary. There was a show called Irene, and a show called Sally. So someone said, why not a musical called Sally, Irene, and Mary? There really was that musical. There has been girls' names in musical theater. They need to be in the title, or they need to have some reference of a girl in the show, at least in the 1920s. And usually that Cinderella story would ring your heart. So I'm going to have Judy Garland ring your heart a little bit here.
For the silver lining, whene'er a cloud appears in the blue, remember somewhere the sun is shining, and so the right thing to do is make it shine for you, a heart full of joy and gladness will always banish sadness and strife. So always look for the silver lining and try to find the sunny side of life.
The ultimate Cinderella, for sure. Now, the heroine of the 1920s musical, she was always Irish, a good-hearted poor orphan who used slangy banter to win the hand of her millionaire suitor. The living embodiment of the jazz-age Cinderella was a petite blonde beauty who looked sweet, but danced hot. Sounds a little like a comes on the stage. Ooh, if you can get your competition to say something that nice, it must be pretty good. In 1920, Florian Ziegfeld showcased his All-American Cinderella in a new show with music by Jerome Kern. By the time the curtain fell on the show Sally, their spunky heroine had become a Folly star, just as Marilyn Miller had become a star in real life. Every star on Broadway is a testament to the pluck and luck and achievement and all the values that come with the package of what we hope for, what our American dream is, even if we haven't yet achieved it. You dream that you'd be able to dance in front of a real audience. Our culture, our American culture, is a culture of optimism. And what the musical sells is optimism. Your dreams can come true on Broadway. You can go to Broadway and you'll always be a star. Whether you come from Williamsville or Brownsville or the Bronx, your dreams may come true. As Judy Garland says, look for that silver lining and try find the sunny side of life. Kind of got between verses there, but Sally captured the willful optimism of the age, and Marilyn Miller became living proof that Broadway could turn a dancing Cinderella from Indiana into a national star. In the 20s on Broadway, it was an age of wonderful nonsense. You could have a good time seeing, just the variety is crazy. Musical comedy did not rely on memorable stories at that point. For 50 cents, you could get a ticket to see the zany antics of the Marx Brothers live. Take a listen to this.
Well, hello? I must be going. I cannot say I came to say I must be going. I'm glad I came, but just the same I must be going. La la.
But I told you must stay. If you should go away, you spoil this coffee. I am sorry.
I'll stay a week or two. I'll stay the summer through. But I am telling you, I must be I'll do anything you say. In fact, I'll even stay. But I must be.
But I must be going. So, I'll do anything you say. I'll even stay and tell you a little bit more about the American musical. The idea of a musical was you have to have a funny story or a silly story or a star vehicle, something that shows off your star, and then you have to have a dance number, of course. The quintessential show of the 1920s was a review. The musical reviews of that time were a show of the pluralism of American life. They captured a little bit of everything. They were not musicals the way we think of them today. They were not book musicals like Showboat was. They didn't have a story. They didn't have actors playing characters. They were loosely held together reviews, and they featured the songs and the stars. And they may already be doing their own skits that they had left over from vaudeville. Here's a little W.C. Fields.
Mr. McGonagall, you sit here.
Please don't call me mister, it's so formal. Call me Mark Anthony. Mark for short.
Oh, Marky.
Marky. You pierced my heart.
Now, Bertha, not too fast.
No, ma'am.
And don't drown me.
Yes, ma'am.
In the sound feature films that he starred in, Fields often played a down-on-his-luck patriarch, always looking for a way to make it big in life. Sometimes his characters were scheming con men, but more often than not, they were caring family men underneath it all.
W.C. Fields, or you might see Bert Lauer. Now, you know Bert Lauer as the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, but he was also on vaudeville.
Number 1, 2. I got a number 3, 4. I got a number woof, woof. I got a number eyes for mugging. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, woof, 11, 12, woof, woof, 14, 15.
You hear a little bit of the lion in there. the star vehicle. Now, the star at that time that everyone wanted to see was Al Jolson.
Mammy, Mammy, the sunshine beat, the sunshine wet, but I know where the sunshine ends. Mammy, Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around. Well, Mammy, I'm a coming. Sorry, I made you wait. I'm coming. I hope and trust I'm not too late. Mammy, Mammy, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. For my Mammy, oh, Mammy, my little Mammy.
This actually
The
used to
sunshine
make
feel,
people
the sunshine sweat.
cry just to see him. On stage, he would have this vulnerability that you can't really hear in the audio. But in real life, he was brash and difficult to deal with. He was a big diva. But on stage, there was something real about him. He was the biggest star of the Prohibition era, was Al Jolson. He was a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe who began his career in minstrel shows. He was the self-proclaimed world's greatest entertainer, and his black-faced mammy songs actually brought audiences to tears. Here's this Lithuanian Jew from a shtetl singing about my homeland in Dixie and my lost mother. The homeland was a homeland of the mind, a place where your sadness can be healed. He could never have done that in his own persona. But hiding behind that black-faced mask, he could go out there and just let it all out, and the audiences were immensely moved. The musical came from a very, very complicated place. Even if the end result seemed to be joyful and optimism and the human spirit soaring, their birth started in a dark, really peculiar, really interesting place like minstrelsy. It's very hard for us to understand blackface today. As an institution today, it's so clearly racist and demeaning and stereotypical. But I do think that there's another side to it, which is why pieces of it still show up in musicals. Besides systemic racism, there is an artistic reason, and I think Al Jolson represents that. For Al Jolson, the whole persona came from a different place. For him, it wasn't about belittling black people, but in expressing himself. And he needed to hide behind this clownish mask to allow his performance to have a depth and a vulnerability. And that's where his star power came from, not really from the makeup. It's a shame, more than a shame, that that was what he needed to use. Would have been better if his mask could have been something a little more of his own background. But no, he used the times, the day, what people were responding to then.
Settle back, folks. You ain't heard nothing yet.
Everything seems lovely when you start to roam. The birds are singing the day that you stray, but wait until you are further away. Things won't be so lovely when you're all alone. Here's what you'll keep saying when you're far from home. Mammy, Mammy, the sun shines east, the sun shines west. I know where the sun shines best.
made me love you, Al Jolson. You made the whole audience love you. Jolson was a really crazy, kind of neurotic man. He was very defensive, very difficult in that kind of prima donna way. He'd become a star and he defined what it meant to be a star, to act like a star in such a way that there wasn't much room for anyone else up there but Al Jolson. Al Jolson, here's some weird things, okay? Maybe having to be in blackface twisted his mind too, because he used to have to turn the faucets on in the sink when other people in his show were getting applause. Talk about insecurity. Oof. Jolson stopped a show that he was in when he thought the show was going badly, saying, "Folks, we know how this story ends. Let's just stop here and I'll sing my songs." You either took Jolson on his terms or you didn't take him at all. A friend of his had actually said, "I always thought he overacted and overplayed, but the audience of that era loved it. They certainly didn't agree with my opinion." You need to know about Al Jolson to know about musical theater. I'm just wild about Harry, and Harry's wild about me. Oh, the heavenly kisses of his missus fill me with ecstasy. So many of the songs that we think of about 1920s were made popular by Al Jolson. Right around that same time, U.B. Blake was one of the first celebrity composers. He was quoted as saying, "Proudest day of my life was when Shuffle Along," show he wrote, debuted on Broadway. At intermission, I hear all these white people saying, "I would like to touch him, the man who wrote that music." At last, I felt like I was a human being. Good thing we've come a little farther than that. The invention or the creation of jazz by black artists sort of gave this country a language it was searching for. It gave it a rhythm identity, and so it makes perfect sense that the composers would use this invented language and rhythm for the theater. A jazz show like no other arrived on Broadway on May 23rd, 1921, produced on a shoestring, with borrowed costumes and secondhand sets. Shuffle Along featured a rich, rousing score by Noble Sicily and U.B. Blake. James Herbert Blake was born in 1883 and raised in Baltimore by a devoutly religious mother and a hard-drinking father. As a youngster, U.B. first syncopated church hymns on an organ, and at 15 he had a regular job as a pianist in a boarding house. After World War I, he and vocalist Noble Sicily developed a vaudeville act called the Dixie Duo. When they joined forces with another team, Miller and Lyle, Shuffle Along musical was born. Great comedic talent, great songwriting, and they are introducing a kind of romantic quality about black performers that had never before been seen on stage. Forget being unseen, they weren't even allowed. There is a ballad that's introduced in the show called "Love Will Find a Way." It was the first time there was a romantic song for a black character. Let me play you a little of that. Come, dear, and don't let our faith weaken. Let's keep all the fires burning school that way. Try each tear dimmed eye. Clouds will soon roll by, though fate may lead us astray. My darling, mark what I say. Love will find a way. Love will find a way. Beautiful, and definitely different from the nonsense songs and the silly things that had been heard. From Black theater, we hear sincerity and love and real relationships. This was profoundly risky, but it paid off. That song was a hit, and the precedent was set. With Shuffle Along, there was still unquestionably a certain amount of minstrelsy still going on, but because it was created by Black artists and performed by Black artists, you had a chance to see the real juice, the real spark. Not just white people interpreting Black performance or Black performers doing white people's vision of Black culture. That must have been an exhilarating thing at the time, to see authenticity blow you away. Shuffle Along cracked open Broadway's door to Black talent, and for the first time there was a section of audience reserved for Black patrons. Reviews were all raves. It was when the chorus and the principals get going with the dances that the world just seems a brighter place to live. That's one of the reviews. They wiggle and shimmy, it says, to shake off all evil, and that appeared in the New York Herald Tribune on May 24th, 1921. The world seems a brighter place to live. They published even more details. Shuffle Along was very popular. It was a very clever show, very fast-moving, lots of good dancing, of course. Ziegfeld had to pick that up, because it was the talk of the town. Ziegfeld asked in all the dancers and singers and performers from Shuffle Along to teach his own chorus girls. Many, many people were influenced by Shuffle Along. Irving Berlin said he went back to see it many times, and there's no question that the Gershwins were influenced by it. Langston Hughes said that for nearly 2 years, the show was always completely packed. Shuffle Along gave a scintillating send-off to the Negro Vogue in Manhattan. It gave the proper push that spread to books, African sculpture, music, and dancing, becoming something that were embraced as part of American culture. The unexpected success of Shuffle Along inspired a spate of new Black musicals, which in turn generated interest in Harlem nightclubs. And that introduced a whole new generation of Black entertainers. Harlem and Broadway are having a fine old time in the 20s. A lot of your top jazz performers like Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, James P. Johnson, they're playing in nightclubs in Harlem and writing Broadway reviews and appearing in them. This was a period in which everyone was crossing borders and boundaries. There was this incredible cross-fertilization and cultural appropriation out of admiration. It was in the 20s, everyone had permission to visit each other's lands and see what they were doing. Broadway's most contagious contribution to the jazz age was a Black show with a white producer. George White produced Running Wild. It brought pumping knees and flapping arms to the entire country with a dance called the Charleston. George White used to like to think he invented 1920s dance. He liked to think he was the guy that said, hey, I have this great dance. The Black Bottom, the Charleston. Whether he invented these dances or not, he definitely did put them in front of the audience in a way so that you couldn't get a song out of, how when you get like a song and it keeps playing in your head over and over and over again, these dances were just like that. Let me give you a little Charleston. dancer, he respected dancers and he hired a lot of dancers. He hired an incredible, gifted, young composer early on named